So before I invite the next panelists on board, I would just like to give an introduction to the next session. So this is the book which was brought out by, which is edited by Devdeep Ganguly of the ashram and Gautam Chikarmane. It's called Reading Sri Aurobindo. Now, both of them have been unable to come because they've been invited somewhere else. However, they have both sent a short letter which they wanted me to read out. So I will do that and then invite everybody on stage. So this is from, So he says, we are glad to know that our book Reading Sri Aurobindo is being discussed in the first edition of the Auroville Literature Festival. This work, a collective endeavor involving 21 authors, was meticulously curated to offer diverse perspectives on Sri Aurobindo's writings, especially as we commemorate his 150th birth anniversary. In today's rapidly evolving global landscape, where challenges and uncertainties abound, Sri Aurobindo's profound insights into human nature, spirituality, and the evolution of consciousness are pathways into the future. They provide a compass for individuals and groups seeking deeper meaning and purpose amidst the cacophony of our times. His vision offers a beacon of hope and a call to inner reflection, both of which are crucial in navigating the complexities of our modern world. Though we are unable to attend in person, we hope that our work stimulates meaningful dialogue on the continuing importance of Sri Aurobindo's work. Such conversations can rekindle interest and open avenues for both personal growth and societal transformation. With best wishes from Gautam Chikarmane and Devdeep Ganguly. So we just give them a hand for this. So that is the book, which is also available in the bookshop for those of you who are interested. So now may I invite on stage Richard Hartz, Larry Seidlitz, Dr. Sampadananda Mishra, and Uday Arya. So to my left, we have Richard Hartz, and he studied philosophy. Yes, please. Yes. He studied philosophy at Yale University and South Asian languages and literature at the University of Washington. He has lived in India and at the Sri Aurobindo ashram since 1980, and he works in the Sri Aurobindo archives and is the editor of the complete works of Sri Aurobindo, all 36 volumes. The editor, one of the editors. Okay, one of the editors, all right. I think the other one is at the back. He teaches at the Center of Education and is the author of The Clasp of Civilizations. And so that's a brief outline on him. I'll go next to Dr. Sampadananda, sitting at the far end. So he is an author, philosopher, and spiritual teacher who has written extensively on Indian philosophy, spirituality, and culture. He is the author of the Rishi tradition of India, and he has also translated several works of Indian culture and literature into English, and currently the Director of Human Sciences at Rishi Hood University, NCR, Delhi. Larry Seidlitz is a devotee and scholar of Sri Aurobindo. And the Mother's Integral Yoga. He has authored 3 books and several articles on yoga. For 16 years, he edited Collaboration, an American journal on integral yoga. And currently he edits Invocation, which is published by the Savitri Bhavan, which you may visit on Sunday. There he also leads a study circle and is a scholar and instructor with Sakar. And finally, we come to the youngest on this panel, Uday Arya. Uday grew up in the ashram, I guess, right? Yes, born and he grew up in the ashram, taught history and critical thinking at the ashram school. And he returned to India after 14 years in New York and Paris, where he worked in various capacities in finance and banking, and is now the founding partner of Blue Lotus, which has funded over 80 startups while tracking new experiments in education in which he has great hope. Okay, let me start. Since this is a literature festival, I'd like to start first with Sri Aurobindo's his magnum opus, Savitri, and his contribution also in poetic theory. So Richard, would you take that on Savitri and on...
Okay, but there's a little bit of a problem here, because once I start talking about Savitri and the future poetry, I'm going to take up more time than we... yeah. Okay. Now, there are so many ways that one can approach Savitri, and also I've been asked to talk about another work of Sri Aurobindo's, which I didn't write the chapter on in reading Sri Aurobindo. I wonder, though, if first we should say a little bit more about the book itself, because not everybody is familiar with the book Reading Sri Aurobindo, which came out about a year ago. And this book covers the 36 volumes of Sri Aurobindo's complete works. So if we have about 45 minutes for this panel, 36 volumes of about 500 pages each, it means that we have to go at about 500 pages a minute, roughly, which obviously is impossible. So one has to be very selective about what one says. And I actually wrote 4 chapters of this book. The one on translations, Sri Aurobindo's translations, literary translations from Sanskrit, Bengali, Tamil, Latin, and Greek. And the volume on the record of yoga, Sri Aurobindo's diary, as well as Vedic and philological studies, one of the 3 volumes on Sri Aurobindo's work on the Veda, and in addition, Savitri. So now what's interesting, and maybe it's a good starting point, is how all of those books are connected, because actually all of Sri Aurobindo's writings are connected in ways which I think make this book really worth reading, because normally, because Sri Aurobindo was such a prolific writer, it's very difficult to get an overview of his thought as a whole. And reading Sri Aurobindo with a chapter on each of the main titles in those 36 volumes. It's not 36 chapters because a number of volumes or a number of books are published in 2 volumes, like The Life Divine, The Synthesis, Savitri. And in 1 or 2 cases, 1 volume contains 2 major books, particularly The Human Cycle and The Ideal of Human Unity. So in any case, reading Sri Aurobindo contains quite concise chapters on all of these important works of Sri Aurobindo. To take the 4 books that I wrote about, take translations, for example. An interesting aspect of Savitri is that because it's based on a legend from the Mahabharata, which of course Sri Aurobindo read in Sanskrit, and some of his translations from Sanskrit are from the Mahabharata, although not of the Savitri legend, still Savitri has an aspect of translation to it. In fact, there are even a few places where Sri Aurobindo directly translates the Mahabharata in Savitri. The Savitri has a subtitle, A Legend and a Symbol. The legend is taken from the Mahabharata, although considerably modified, and also reinterpreted as a symbol which Sri Aurobindo thought was originally part of the Vedic cycle, so that relates it to Sri Aurobindo's writings on the Veda as well. But with respect to the Mahabharata, there are places, for example, where the Mahabharata, when it describes Savitri's response to Narad's disclosure of the fate of Satyavan, there's a phrase where she says, Sakrid anshoni patati, once the die falls. And Sri Aurobindo translates that literally in Savitri, once the dice fall. Once the dice fall, thrown by the hand of fate in an eternal moment of the gods. It's part of her response to Narad. And so there are places like that where Sri Aurobindo almost directly translates the Mahabharata from Sanskrit. As I said, he also had a Vedic idea. He understood the original symbolism of the story of Savitri in Vedic terms, which he explains in the note which is published at the beginning of the book as the author's note. He saw in the names of the characters, which are quite Vedic, Savitri, Satyavan, Ashwapati, Dumatsena are all Vedic. Narad is not, but all of the other names are quite Vedic in their significance and suggest that Sri Aurobindo may have been right in taking the origins of this legend of the conquest of death as Vedic, and then retold in the Mahabharata in a later age, what Sri Aurobindo calls in the human cycle the typal age, whereas originally the legend had originated in the symbolic age of the Veda. But in any case, there are also passages where Sri Aurobindo alludes to besides the general reinterpretation of the Mahabharata legend, not in terms of dharma, but in terms of spiritual transformation, in which Sri Aurobindo found much of the secret of the supramental yoga in the Veda. So therefore, the Veda is extremely important for understanding Savitri. But there are passages where it also alludes to the Veda. There are lines that don't make much sense if you're not at all familiar with Sri Aurobindo's interpretation of the Veda. For example, a darkness carrying morning in its breast looked for the eternal wide returning gleam, waiting the advent of a larger ray and rescue of the lost herds of the sun. There are two different Vedic allusions there in just 4 lines. First, the eternal wide returning gleam refers to the eternal succession of the dawns that are coming, which is from the very opening of the Life Divine, where Sri Aurobindo begins the Life Divine with a translation of some verses from a hymn to dawn, Usha, the dawn, and the Sanskrit is Parayati Nam Anueti Pataha. Let me see. Yes.
That is, yes, the whole Vedic symbolism, all that is.
Yeah.
What you explained just now about the Vedic symbolism, that's very clear. But the fact that he marries that with the iambic pentameter, all through that is a very interesting thing, that whole combination, what becomes Savitri.
Yeah, okay. For lack of time, I won't elaborate on this point about the Veda. In fact, I was going to come next to this other aspect, which is in a way even more important. What I want to do, and in the volume on translations, the relation of that to Savitri is also interesting from this point of view, because Sri Aurobindo translated from both European and Indian languages. He was educated, of course, in England, and his whole thought is a synthesis of East and West. The result is that he wrote Savitri in English, in spite of its deep roots in the Indian tradition, specifically in Sanskrit literature going back to the Vedas and the Mahabharata. Savitri is primarily a work of world literature. It can only really be understood in the context of world literature. World literature is a term which has been used quite a lot ever since Goethe in the 1820s started to talk about Weltliteratur. And then at the beginning of the 20th century, Tagore talked about Vishwasahitya. So Savitri has to be situated in a context of world literature, and it situates itself quite explicitly in that context, not only through the fact that it's written in English, it's an epic in 12 books like the Aeneid and Paradise Lost, but also it alludes frequently to classics of Western literature. For example, just after the speech of Savitri, in which she translates, where Sri Aurobindo has translated the words from the Mahabharata. Just after that, there's the queen replies to Savitri. And there are these lines: "Too hard for us is heaven's indifference. Our own tragedies are not enough for us. All pathos and all sufferings we make ours. We have sorrow for a greatness passed away and feel the touch of tears in mortal things. Even a stranger's anguish rends my heart, and this, O Narad, is my well-loved child." Now, in the middle of that passage, there's a line which Sri Aurobindo himself referred to as a translation of Virgil, the line "Sunt lacrimae rerum et mentum mortalia tangunt." He translated it somewhere in iambic, in dactylic hexameters, like Virgil: "Haunted by tears is the world, and our hearts by the touch of things mortal." In Savitri, he's translated it, "and feel the touch of tears in mortal things." And in one of his letters, that's again an important book in the complete works, closely related to the future poetry, Letters on Poetry and Art. In one of those, he specifically refers to this line as being a translation of Virgil. So Sri Aurobindo was weaving Savitri into world literature as he knew it, ancient and modern. There are allusions to modern poetry, also at least up to Walt Whitman, the long passage at the end of the fourth canto on the sailor, the explorer and the mariner, the sailor on the flow of time, is quite similar to in some ways to the ending of Walt Whitman's passage to India. And this brings me to the question of the relation of Savitri to 20th century literature, where around the time that Sri Aurobindo was beginning to write Savitri, and also was writing the future poetry in 1917, he started to write the future poetry. Around that time, English literature in particular, as well as Western literature in general, was undergoing a revolutionary change, which Sri Aurobindo referred to later as a violent change in the aesthetic atmosphere, because of which he said that his early poetry belonged to the past, while his later poetry still belongs to the future and would require another great change to be understood and appreciated. Okay, fine, okay.
Can we do it at the end? We have these. Just keep it.
Anu, there's a mic on
Sampadananda
stage.
ji, I'll go to you next. Since we've got into this whole thing of the Vedas, would you speak of Sri Aurobindo's work with The Secret of the Vedas, the Hymns to Mystic Fire? So we'd like to keep it, say, within 7 minutes, if we can. So each one has, and then I'm sure there are plenty of questions coming there.
Okay, so you want me to speak on The Secret of the Veda, Hymns to the Mystic Fire? or the chapter that I have written here in this book. The chapter that I contributed here in this book on which the panel is happening is Sri Aurobindo's Bengali writings and Sanskrit writings. Maybe I'll link it a little bit with the Veda. These are some, Sri Aurobindo's writings about which many people do not know. That Sri Aurobindo, many people even do not know that Sri Aurobindo wrote in Sanskrit, or he had an enormous knowledge of Sanskrit. So he studied Sanskrit, though he had no contact with any other language, but he mastered Sanskrit, translated a lot of texts starting from the Vedas, epics, Ramayana, Mahabharata, Kalidasa's texts, and wrote originally in Sanskrit. So his Bengali writings, though many people are familiar with, but the Sanskrit writings, which I will focus a little bit, which many are not familiar with, out of his many writings in Sanskrit, but those are not really many, but compared to whatever he has contributed, so the prominent ones are 4. The first writing in Sanskrit of Sri Aurobindo is Sri Aurobindo Upanishad. That in an Upanishadic style, using the Upanishadic language, he has condensed, you can say, the whole Upanishadic philosophy and his own realizations, spiritual realizations, in a small text called Sri Aurobindo Upanishad, which was published and translated by Jagannath Vedalankarji first into English. And the whole text is available for reading, where in the same way that each Upanishad does, describing the importance of a Brahman, he does that. But at the same time, he addresses to the whole humanity as Anandasya Putra, the children of delight. Like the Veda says, Amritasya Putra. And then he invites the humanity to merge with that Ananda, experience that Ananda, as the Upanishad itself says that everything comes from Ananda, lives in Ananda and merges into Ananda. So that's the crux of Sri Aurobindo's Upanishad called Sri Aurobindo Upanishad. The next important writing in Sanskrit is Bhavani Bharati. Yesterday, while giving a little bit of introduction to Sri Aurobindo, Sanjeev Sanyal, he mentioned about the writing of Bhavani Mandir. But that Bhavani Mandir took the whole idea that he has presented in Bhavani Mandir, as if, like it took a poetic form in Sanskrit called Bhavani Bharati. Even the name, he didn't give name Bhavani Bharati to it. Later it was revised, edited, and then translated. I think Richard has done the English translation of that. Now Bhavani Bharati is available in translation in many Indian languages. But what is important that you see the power of poetry as he has done it in rest of his poetry, Savitri and other poetic works. But a marvelous poetry that one finds, and a combination of a Vedic and classical thoughts that one finds in Bhavani Bharati. And when I was editing this book with many translations, I did a little bit of research into the metrical pattern that Sri Aurobindo used. So many people know that Bhavani Bharati is composed in Upajati meter, which is a 11-syllabled meter mixture of Upendra Vajra and Indra Vajra, 2 varieties of 11-syllabled Trishtup meter. But if you scan through, like I have presented a paper on this, so when we scan through the each and every verse in Bhavani Bharati, it's not one Upajati meter which he has used. He has used 3 different meters, Upajati, Indra Vajra and Upendra Vajra, 3 different meters. There are differences, but what is more fascinating and important is that Sri Aurobindo was completely aware of the varieties, the variations of Upajati meter, the mixture of Indra Vajra and Upendra Vajra. And in tradition, in Sanskrit tradition, poetic tradition, there are 14 varieties of Upajati, the mixture of this Indra Vajra and Upendra Vajra, and Sri Aurobindo has utilized all the 14 varieties. So all these are small nuances when we talk about the poetic meters that Sri Aurobindo has used, and that shows the depth in which he had gone into the Sanskrit poetry. And the third incomplete text in Sanskrit is Tantrika Siddhi Prakaranam. Sri Aurobindo wanted to write a full-fledged treatise on Tantra in Sanskrit. Of course, Sri Aurobindo's entire integral philosophy and integral yoga has much resonance. I mean, it resonates more with the tantric system of yoga. And where he wanted a full-fledged treatise summarizing the tantric philosophy, the tantric vision, the vision of Tantra, but he couldn't complete it, but from his notebook, and this is what is assumed from his huge notebook, of which Tantrika Siddhi Prakaranam is a part. And it's a small part where he describes about like the upasana of Kali, and how Kali helps destroying the tamasic, rajasic and sattvic ego and raises the sadhak to become a siddha. And it's a small text written in sutra style. And this text was not known to many people. Even it was not published in the archives and research. In 2008, January issue of Mother India, where it got first time published, and then I worked in collaboration with archives with Richard and others, and then got it translated into English. So it's for the first time it came to limelight in 2008. And the other Sanskrit writing which is famous, many people know about it, is Sapta Chatushtaya, though it is not a Sanskrit writing, but he has received certain sutras, or he followed the early years of his sadhana following the Sapta Chatushtaya, where there are 7 into 4, 28 sutras, you can say. And he has his own commentary called the Sopagya Vritti, you can say, in English, where he has explained. So these are the 4 major Sanskrit writings of Sri Aurobindo, and about which I have written my own experience in this book. And in addition to that, his Bengali writings. Of course, the Bengali writing, when my first contact with Sri Aurobindo came through his Bengali writings, the Gitar Bhumika, the introduction that he has written to the Gita. I mean, he has written these essays on the Gita, but Gitar Bhumika, in what he writes in Bengali, and you have the English translation of that, many aspects of, many unknown aspects of the Gita, what gets revealed in his Bengali writings of on the Gita, Gitar Bhumika, introduction to Gita, one doesn't find those in essays on the Gita. So many interesting aspects about the politics. For example, like why did Duryodhan, like when the war happened, just in the beginning of the war, Duryodhan gets down and then he approaches to Dronacharya instead of approaching Bhishma, who is commander-in-chief. So why does he approach to Dronacharya? What he discusses with the Dronacharya? Why did he do that? This entire politics of Mahabharata and the diplomacy of Duryodhan, the way Sri Aurobindo has described in the Gitar Bhumika, is something really fascinating. So these are the words that I offer about the writings that I did, the chapter I wrote in this book, Reading Sri Aurobindo. Thank you.
Yeah. Thank you very much, Sampadananji. So talking about Sapta Chatushtaya and Savitri as a means of ascension, that's, let's bring it to Larry now, because you've been running this journal on integral yoga. You've also written about that. So would you like to speak on that, whether it's the letters of yoga or on that? Yeah.
In Sri Aurobindo's complete works, there's 4 volumes, 4 pretty heavy volumes on his letters on yoga. So something like maybe 3,000 pages just on elaborating on his yoga to the disciples. So that's in addition to the synthesis of yoga, which is more of a systematic treatise on the integral yoga. There's also other volumes that relate quite closely to the yoga. For example, there's his letters on the mother and letters on himself, where a lot of it also comes into play. So it's a vast treasure of knowledge. As I was listening to even the earlier talk and the panelists here, we see such a vast scope of history that's been taken into account. And we see through Sri Aurobindo's translations, Sanskrit translations, and also his writings in Sanskrit, his taking of Savitri from the Mahabharata. Sri Aurobindo takes this huge scope into his view, into his writings. And one of the things that struck me, one of the letters on yoga that I highlight in the chapter of the first volume of his letters on yoga, is his conception of the divine. And Sri Aurobindo conceives of the divine not simply as a transcendent being beyond the universe, beyond us, to which we might ascend in our inner consciousness. But he also conceives of the divine as the cosmic spirit, as the cosmic being, as this universe in which we live. So then that brings into the scope of the divine everything. And he also conceives of the divine as seated within ourselves, within each individual. So that also brings our own personal life into the scope of consideration of his conception of the divine. And it gives then a supreme importance to the universe, to the history, to the evolution, which is another central concept of his view of existence, that it is evolving from inconscience, from matter, towards reunification, a conscious reunification with the divine in all its three different aspects. So all of life becomes so significant, all becomes a part of this movement of consciousness and relates it to the supreme, to the divine being, who is at once transcendent, who encompasses this universe in which we live, this world in which we live, our environment, and also our individual life. So this gives, I think, some explanation for Sri Aurobindo's consideration of all of these different aspects in his writings, his concern with the history of mankind and the development of human societies, and these ancient developments that took place during the Vedic times, where the rishis were undergoing realization of these truths, these same truths, which he is uncovering. And I think, in that aspect, we have these ancient writings of the Vedas and Upanishads, but who is it that has really brought in their significance to modern humanity? I mean, I don't know, before Sri Aurobindo, there was, translations of the Vedas, but they didn't give a very deep explanation of what was really there. And similarly, even the Upanishads, He's given a conception where he found that also it, in certain aspects of the Upanishads, really embraced life and sought a realization that encompassed life, especially in the Ishu Upanishad. So that's just, I think, the one kind of point I wanted to bring out. I think we're short of time, so then we'll...
So I want to go to Uday. So when you're talking about what he was trying to achieve is to bring all that knowledge towards modern life. And Uday, you've written a chapter on essays, human and divine, which broaches many of those things of the concepts which take us forward. Would you like to go on that?
Sure, I'll actually start with something very personal, which is that when I first, the original title of this book was "The Hour of God" in the SABCL edition, and it was a inspiring moment. I still remember time and again on Sundays when I would have time to look at our bookshelf to see a book that was titled "The Hour of God." I didn't touch it for many years. I used to only open his collected poems. But just think about the title, "The Hour of God." And in fact, that's one of the titles of one of the essays, which the mother also reads for us separately. So this book is actually not a book that was published during Sri Aurobindo's lifetime. It was published in several different formats. In fact, the current book, which is Essays, Divine and Human, has a fantastic notes on the text section at the end, which gives you the full detail of the publishing history. Fascinating in itself. But this initial part of the book is dwelling a lot on miscellaneous but fascinating essays on a vast range of topics. One of them, personally of great relevance to me as a student, as a teacher, is titled "On Original Thinking." And many teachers that I'm familiar with have all across India and other parts of the world have shared this extensively. And ideally, it would even be one of the foundational documents of our national education policy. But in the middle of this book, there is something super interesting, which is a whole section on the science of consciousness. So this is part 2 of the book. It's called "From Man to Superman," and it contains something which all of us have heard, or at least come across in one way or another. It's this recurring idea that man is a transitional being. He is not final. These words themselves are radical and revolutionary in themselves, because even in the Indian tradition, to state this is actually above and beyond what the highest ideal of spiritual attainment refers to. The fact that man himself is to be gone beyond is so radical. And he says it over and over again in different ways. And there are actually several drafts of his expressions in this context. And each one is beautiful and inspiring. But separately, there's also this 50-page section on the science of consciousness. My hope is eventually there will be a much larger compilation and a study which brings out more and more aspects. But these are actually a series of notes and fragments which were written over almost a 30-year period. So from 1913 to almost the late 1940s. And it's just incredible. He gives a formulation, a study. He addresses the subject of consciousness from every imaginable angle that you can think of and conceive of. And he does it so beautifully. And the current book, which is Essays, Divine and Human, is probably picking up just for this one reason, which is on the science of consciousness, which is just 50 pages-ish. But what brought me to the book and what drew me to the book and what I would suggest and invite others also to explore is the last section, which is actually part 4 of this book, which is thoughts and aphorisms. So these aphorisms of Sri Aurobindo are, in 1913, he penned hundreds of these scintillating aphorisms, which are so provocative, so alarming, startling, and insightful and beautiful. I could go on, but I would like to read just before you a couple of things that Sri Aurobindo has said on this method, why it's interesting. And I found out about this a little later, in about 10, 15 years ago, which is even when he commented on the philosophers of Greece. So when you think about the sages of Greece, right, the great Socrates, Plato, who there's extensive writings on these individuals in the Western tradition. Who does Sri Aurobindo choose to comment on in Greece amongst all the great galaxy of fantastic individuals on Greece? It's an aphoristic philosopher, which is Heraclitus. So why is that? So Sri Aurobindo says about this method, this aphoristic method, this method has great advantages. It prevents the mind from getting encrusted in details and fossilizing there. It leaves a wide room and great latitude for originality and the delicate play of individuality in the details. It allows a science to remain elastic and full of ever new potentialities for the discoverer. One of the aphorisms which he mentions just in passing is, the gods are mortals, the men immortals. So think about that. Again, runs so counter to how we would think of these, but a few more, if I may. God's laughter is sometimes very coarse and unfit for polite ears. So you have something which, again, defies the idea of what is God supposed. I thought he's supposed to be this stern, solemn individual. And here he's talking about God's laughter being coarse and unfit for polite ears. A God who cannot smile could not have created this humorous universe. So humorous world itself is a radical conception, but humorous universe is going still further beyond, and a God who cannot smile. Again, so counter. So these are ideas and beautiful insights that open up the mind and heart in ways that a normal essay or poem may not. So I would even think of it, since this is a literature festival, that you have essays, you have poetry, all of which we love, and then you also have aphorisms, which are, these pithy but very, very penetrating phrases which open us up in incredible ways. I'll end with just a couple more. There's a lot. There's this whole section in aphorisms which go on. For example, history and historicity. So one might ask, by the way, I used to teach history in the ashram school, but one of the challenges for me as a teacher is, how do you approach the subject of history in the light of Sri Aurobindo? It's a challenge. It's not easy. So when I come across these aphorisms of Sri Aurobindo, and again, there is so much of light flash type opening that happens when you read some of these. It's indescribable. But I'll just read a couple more and close out. To commit adultery with God is the perfect experience for which the world was created. Not to have heard the voice of God and his angels is the world's idea of sanity. So I'll just pause there, but it's a beautiful, beautiful section. So if you have the interest, a flaming interest, please do pick it up.
Thank you. I just want to tell everybody that we have a whole section on Sabda books, which includes Thoughts and Aphorisms, Savitri, Integral, Synthesis of Yoga, Secret of the Vedas, it's all there. Now, we had invited one other person. Gautam, please we'll just hold it. Suresh, can you play that last bit? So this is Rag Yadav. He's a young, he's the assistant professor of law at the National School of India in Bangalore. And he's currently the GE Professor Madhav Menon Scholar, focusing on Indian thought. And he was a Rhodes Scholar at Oxford University. So he gives a commentary as a reader who reading Sri Aurobindo. So we just have that, and we'll come to you immediately after.
Good morning, everyone. I'm very glad to participate in the first edition of the Auroville Literature Festival. My congratulations to Anu and to Sudha and to the rest of the team for bringing together such a wonderful program, and my thanks for inviting me. I'm sorry I couldn't make it there in person because I'm traveling. Anu had asked me to reflect briefly on the book Reading Sri Aurobindo, edited by Mr. Chikarmane and Devdeep, which came out last year, and also to offer my own thoughts on reading and writing on Sri Aurobindo. So what I'm going to try and do in the next quick 5 minutes is to try and outline what I think are the important and valuable additions that this book, Reading Sri Aurobindo, makes to the existing literature on Sri Aurobindo, and end with a few thoughts on where I think the future writing trajectory may lie. Now, this book, Reading Sri Aurobindo, I think serves four very important functions. And I'm going to try and quickly outline them. The first thing that this book does very well is that it provides an easy, accessible running start to the fairly large and intimidating collected works of Sri Aurobindo, which stand at 36 volumes. Now, as any reader of Sri Aurobindo would know, the sheer breadth and depth of these volumes makes it difficult for any but the most intrepid readers to be able to access his thought. And I teach Sri Aurobindo's human cycle at a course at my university on political thought. And one of the first questions I get asked by my students, to which I did not have a clear answer until this volume came out, is, can you suggest one introductory volume where we can get a basic sense of where Sri Aurobindo's thought trajectory is going? Now, at this point, to point them either to the Life Divine or to Savitri or to the Synthesis of Yoga is probably not a wise strategy, because it will probably put them off. So what this book does very well is that it provides the intelligent lay reader who is interested in Sri Aurobindo's thought but perhaps not yet committed to reading the entire collected works, a nice break-in or a nice running start to be able to access those volumes and to make sense of them in an introductory fashion, to see which areas particularly pique their interest and to then accordingly go and read those particular volumes. This, with some notable exceptions like Amal Kiran and Nalini Kanta Gupta's collected works, which are out of print currently, unfortunately, was a major lacuna in the existing literature, and this book definitely fills that gap. The second thing that I think this book does very well is that one often faces the question when one begins to read Sri Aurobindo, do I read his works chronologically in the way they were written in the Arya? Do I read them thematically by looking at different subjects across the different volumes, or do I read them volume by volume? Now, there's obviously advantages and disadvantages to each of the reading strategies. But in my own reading of Sri Aurobindo, something that emerged fairly quickly was that his works are best considered as a whole, as providing a common theoretical or conceptual frame, a kind of a web within which these different volumes speak with each other. So to give a few practical examples of that, it would ideally be necessary for one to understand, say, chapter 6 of the human cycle, which speaks of the objective and subjective views of life. It would be useful to alongside read chapter 7 of the Life Divine, which speaks of the Vedantic methods of knowledge. Equally, if I were to read chapter 9 of the Synthesis of Yoga, the release from the ego, a good companion text to that would be chapter 12 of the Life Divine, which speaks of the ascent of life. Now, one may not necessarily always make these links when one approaches Sri Aurobindo's thought, absent a companion reader of the kind that reading Sri Aurobindo provides. So in this way, these kind of fertile links between texts can be made, which allows a reader to navigate through these 36 volumes while trying to maintain some kind of an overall coherence in their reading strategy. Now, this is a major challenge for most readers of Sri Aurobindo. And in an introductory way, the various essays in this volume demonstrate a series of recurrent underlying strains of thought across Sri Aurobindo's writing, and that allows readers to make those connections with relative ease that would otherwise take a fairly long labor of reading to arrive at. So that, I think, is the second very useful addition that this book makes. The third thing that I think this book does well is that it avoids, to a large extent, heavy philosophical vocabulary. Now, this vocabulary is obviously very carefully defined, it's useful, it's required, but as an introductory reader, it may be distracting. And what this volume does well is that it provides a lucid and clear prose where these words are mentioned. They are often explained or defined in fairly easy to understand language. And so for any reader who is not approaching these texts with a prior understanding of the different traditions of knowledge that Sri Aurobindo draws upon and synthesizes, this reader still allows that individual to access these texts without imposing too many demands on prior knowledge. The fourth thing that I think this text does very well is that it focuses on some of Sri Aurobindo's relatively ignored works. So, for example, when one looks at the existing literature on Sri Aurobindo, work on the record of yoga, the human cycle and ideal of human unity, his wonderful volume on the mother, tend to get ignored in writing and scholarship in preference to some of the more foundational texts, as it were, the Life Divine, Savitri, and others. And what this volume does is that it puts these texts back up in the priority list of reading, as it were, and that, I think, is a very valuable addition that this book provides. Now, these are, I think, the four valuable additions that this book makes to the existing literature. What I think is the trajectory going forward, based on my own experience of reading and writing on Sri Aurobindo, is that
Yeah, okay, that's fine. I'm sorry to cut that short, but I think we're really short on time, and it would be nice to have the questions first. So Gautam, now would you come up to the, over there also, there's one right there. Okay. If there are any other questions, could you please raise your hands? Okay. All right. No. Suresh? Suresh?
Hello. Hello. Yeah. Hello. Now, it was a very stimulating session, I must say. But I have something to add, taking a cue from, in fact, all the speakers, starting from Dr. Haas, because in the past there have been wonderful writings on Savitri, and especially in terms of theme, Sri Aurobindo starts from the names. He starts investigating the names, and there he finds a history that was hidden in the past through the names. This is the first thing. And stylistically, it was very well written by V.K. Gokak in his book Sri Aurobindo, Seer and Poet in 1972. That should have been in the book. That is entitled The Elusive Style of Sri Aurobindo. Because Sri Aurobindo is both traditional and untraditional. He is solidly based on tradition, and not just Upanishadic tradition. He is solidly based on Western tradition. And everywhere, and even if you think of the blank verse of which you were speaking, there are two kinds of blank verse used. One is the run-on and the other is the end-stopped. And the end stop contains, as Dr. Sampadananda has said, the sutra. There are two things in Sanskrit, tika and sutra, aphoristic and expository. And talking of aphorism, you cannot just say it is an aphorism, because there are plenty of aphorisms used by Sri Aurobindo, different types. If you go to Puttenham's Handbook of Terms, you can see and examine and relate how Sri Aurobindo has used a very particular apophthegm, because apophthegm is the most serious kind of aphorism, which is a string of synonyms, which is called cases and onomaton. So these things have to be in the book. I think the book should be enlarged with essays by Srinivas Iyengar, V.K. Gokak, and some other experts. Of course, Deshpande on Savitri is the supreme expert. He should not have been excluded from the book. And, well, stylistics is totally ignored with reference to prose style. So this should be included in a revised book. This is my opinion of the book.
Okay. So, yeah, so that looks like another volume that we are looking at. Okay, I think if there are no other questions, oh, there is a question over there. Okay. Please come up, sir.
Hello, I am Narasimha Murthy from Bangalore. The gentleman who spoke before me, he knows a lot of things about Aurobindo, so I don't know much. But I traveled all the way from Bangalore to just to know more about Aurobindo. But what I find missing with the speakers on the stage and the gentleman before me is of course, I've read Upanishads, I've read Vedas, the entire translation. The problem is, of course, I visited Ramakrishna Ashrama and other places. The problem is with the current set of people, nobody is coming on the stage or in their books about their own experiences. They always quote Aurobindo, they quote Vivekananda, they quote Shankaracharya. Of course, it is all their experiences. It is all their bhashya.
Yeah.
And here also, one of the speakers was telling, like the first translations of modern Vedistic ideas came from Aurobindo. But I believe the first translation started with Shankaracharya. Then it went
So,
on.
I will just have to interrupt you a little bit here.
Yeah.
Because, look, this book had a specific, let's say, target, because for Sri Aurobindo's 150th, it was to explore his work. What you're talking about, people's personal, relationship and experience.
Of his works.
Yes. So that, I think there are other books like that, which one can look at, but this is not that book. This is really an exploration of his work, to be able to, like Rag Yadav just said, to make it accessible to many people who have no idea and would like to get a general sense. And that this book definitely does very well. So, I mean...
Yeah, I have not read the book.
No, yeah, so that's it.
Just came
Explore
to
that.
attend
Yeah,
the meeting.
Yeah, thank you. One more question and then we close, please, because we have the next session. Yes.
I would like to know, I have also read some of Sri Aurobindo, of course, not too much. I have not read this particular book, though I'll soon be reading it. But there is one way in which I thought, is there a difference? Can we read Sri Aurobindo in different levels of consciousness? by which I mean that right now we are dealing with Sri Aurobindo's reading from a reason point of view. But if our consciousness changes, it can be, a devotional consciousness. It can even be just a consciousness of just pure entertainment. Can we reach Sri Aurobindo through different levels of consciousness? I would like to ask this question to...
Well, all these learned men over here. Okay. No, you see, I think many of us have experienced that when you read a passage of Sri Aurobindo, say 5 years ago, and you read it 2 years later, even more, and you read it again another 5 years later, because you have expanded, you have grown, so your reading expands with that, and your, let's say, experience expands with that. Am I more or less on the right? Okay. Okay, thank you everybody. Shall we close this session? Please give a big hand and let's get the, yeah.